everyone, welcome back to another video. 2024 was an absolutely amazing reading year for me. I read so many incredible, amazing books and so many new all-time favorites as well. I know that we are now officially in February and well into 2025, but I did want to make a video dedicated to all of the lovely books and new favorites that I got to read this year. In the first half of this video, I'm going to be sharing with you the reading journal spread that I made dedicated to all of these books and kind of the process and how I made it. And then at the end, we will do a little bit more of an in-depth chat for my top 8 favorite books of 2024. I also did actually leave an empty page specifically for this spread in my reading journal before my 2025 spreads, so I feel like it's also just a nice way to say goodbye to 2024 as a year, as a reading year, and kind of just celebrate all the lovely books that I got to read. I ended up choosing 8 books for my top favorite books of the year. Honestly, the main reason is because I had this idea for a journal spread for a little while and I just thought that 8 books would make the most sense to fit. I am also kind of glad that I waited like a month after 2024 ending to really kind of think and reflect on what books truly were my favorite. It honestly took me a long time to narrow down the, I think, 92 books that I read in the year down to my top 8 favorites, but I'm really happy with this list. It feels right. These books mean so much to me. I love them with my whole heart, and so I think that this is a very good representation of just my reading year, my book taste, and this spread just makes me so happy to look at. I think I got this idea from Katie is Reading in one of her journal flip through videos, but essentially my idea was to create like opening little book flabs, I guess, within the journal itself. I absolutely love to use these little like printout book covers. I use them in almost all of my reading journal spreads. I think it's so fun, it adds a lot of color, and a lot of books have really beautiful covers and I just like to include them in my journal. But this is fun because it adds a little bit more of like a 3D interactive element because you can actually like open up the books a little bit, but I'll show you how I do that a little bit later. As for the decorations, I wanted to keep it pretty simple. I went ahead and printed out this really pretty star paper. I just found this pattern on Pinterest, and I feel like it just matched really well with the books I read. I feel like a lot of very whimsical, magical books, and I feel like this paper just kind of fits the general theme going with a lot of these favorites. I just ripped up a couple pieces for the corners because that's just one of my favorite ways to add a little bit of decoration to the spread. And then as for the title, I've really been loving this title technique recently, especially in my reading journal. I just cut up little bits of white cardstock and stuck them a little bit irregularly onto the patterned paper and then ripped around it so it creates almost like a little plaque for the title. Then I went in with my favorite gold gel pen, I think this is a Uniball Signal gel pen by the way, and lettered in 2024 faves. The fun part of this spread is creating the opening book covers. So basically what I did is I cut out some pieces of cardstock, and looking back I think I would probably end up using printer paper instead just because cardstock is quite thick and my journal is almost at its end and it's so thick right now. I'm hoping that I can make it last as long as possible, but after I finished this spread with like the several layers of paper that was included in making these little opening book covers, my journal is like almost splitting open right now, so my recommendation would be to use a thinner paper like printer paper just so that it protects the journal spine a little bit. But anyway, I just cut out some different pieces of cardstock, basically the same height as the book cover. I think these book covers ended up being around like 2.5 inches tall with a scaled width, and for the pieces of cardstock I did the same height but double the width. That way I could stick on the cover and fold it in half, and so it would kind of act as like a real interactive cover, I guess. And then I just stuck on the back side of the cardstock onto the actual spread, so then it creates these little flaps where you can actually open up the books, which I think is just really fun. Originally, I was planning on kind of like writing out a little summary of my thoughts on the book on the inside. I thought that would be kind of fun, but I've just realized I'm just not the biggest fan of like writing down my thoughts on books. I like creating like very visual spreads. I like talking about them, so I did end up doing something a little bit different, a little more fun, a little more visual on the inside of these books because I didn't want them to just open up onto nothing. But again, I'll show you that a little bit later. But for now, I'm just creating all the little book covers and then attaching them to the journal spread. And then now that all of the covers are attached and opening, to finish off this page, I'm just adding a little gold border, which I add borders to pretty much all of my spreads. I feel like it just always completes it and makes it look finished. And then I also filled in all the extra space with some star doodles, as well as just little titles. To be honest, I think I didn't measure super well. I think I could have made the book covers a little bit bigger because I ended up having almost like an awkward amount of space between. So I just lettered in the titles for no particular reason other than just to fill up some extra space. But other than that, that is pretty much it for this spread. I feel like it is pretty simple, like it wasn't too difficult to create and it didn't take me that long, but it looks really cool. So I think I will definitely have to include this more interactive opening book cover concept more in my reading journal spreads because I think it's so fun. Alright everybody, it is the next day and I did want to show you a completed look at the journal spread that I made yesterday for all of my favorite reads of 2024, and I love how this journal spread turned out. I went back and added all these like little pictures off of Pinterest, so it's just like some fan art and some little collages and pictures that kind of summarize the general theme of the book, I suppose. I originally was gonna like write down my little thoughts in these little flaps here. I'm not the biggest fan of writing down my thoughts for books. I prefer to kind of just talk about it or create a visual spread for it. But yeah, this is a completed look at the page. I do love how it looks. So let's go ahead and talk about my favorite books of 2024. I think I'm going to go in chronological order based off of when I read them, not necessarily ranking them. I think that would be too difficult. Honestly, it took me so long to narrow down this list and pick my top favorites. This feels right to me. I'm really happy with this list. I'm very grateful for all the reading that I got to do and all the amazing new stories that I fell in love with. I think if I were to pick like my top favorite book of the year, it would probably be Muse of Nightmares and just this series in general. But from there, don't ask me to rank them. I have absolutely no idea. So I think we'll just go in a chronological order based off of when I read them. But yeah, I just love this list so much. I feel like it really sums up my reading year and my reading taste. I think all these books are fantasy books, but let's just go ahead and talk about the first book. So this is the second book in the Letters of Enchantment duology. The first one is Divine Rivals. This book actually came out, I think, in the last couple of days of 2023, and I picked it up, I got it on the day it came out, and I read it, and I just naturally happened to finish it on like the 1st or 2nd of January. So this was actually the very first book that I read in 2024, which is just a great start to the year, I think. I love the series so much. It's super popular, as it should be. It's incredible, and I'm just a huge fan of Rebecca Ross in general. I've also read her Elements of Cadence duology and another one of her books, and I just think she has the most beautiful, lush, lyrical prose ever, and I love it so much. I think for a long time this series was my favorite of hers. I read the Elements of Cadence in 2023, but I'm actually really wanting to do a reread of that series now. But this one is absolutely amazing. Both of the books were 5 stars. I read Divine Rivals in 2023, and I loved it so much. So if you don't know, this series follows around these 2 rival journalists who are kind of competing for this position at the local newspaper that they work in. It's set in this historical, I want to say 1940s environment, and in the background there is this big war going on between the gods, so there is that kind of fantasy aspect to it. By day, these journalists are kind of pranking each other and competing for this job, but at night they're actually having a bit of a secret correspondence via magical typewriters, and it was just written so beautifully. I think perhaps the best part of the story were the actual letters. I think Rebecca Ross's writing really got to shine through because both of the characters were also writers, and so you can imagine that the letters in this book were just written so beautifully and have some amazing quotes that I just think about all the time, to be honest. This series is magical, it's sad, it's melancholy, it has characters that you're gonna love, and it's just a very heart-achingly beautiful story. I feel like I've heard not the best reviews of this book from some other people. I think in general this sequel kind of follows a little bit more of just the political and war side of things, whereas Divine Rivals is more so about the setup and following the characters and the relationships and friendships and that sort of thing. This one goes more into the more political plot side of things, and I think because of that I do prefer Divine Rivals just a little bit, though I still gave this one a 5 stars and I still loved it so much. There's a trope in here that I feel like is really hard to pull off, and Rebecca Ross just did it so beautifully, and I just enjoyed everything about it. This book made me cry. I loved it so much. I feel like this definitely is one of those books that kind of has a little bit of, I would say, like an umbrella of melancholy. Like the whole story just feels quite a bit sad, and I think that is just maybe a trend when it comes to wartime books. I think that this book specifically goes a lot into all these different themes of war, and though it is like a fictional war with gods and magical typewriters and other magical things, I think a lot of those deeper themes of war and what it's like to live during a time of such stress and tragedy and violence, I think those themes just parallel and kind of symbolize some really beautiful ideas that are very, I think, relatable in a lot of ways, and I just think she does it so well. If you want a series with beautiful writing, beautiful relationships and friendships and found family, just a very emotional, yearning story, then I think you would absolutely love this series, and it's just one of my favorites. So this definitely had to make it into my top favorite of the year because this series does mean so much to me. I love it so much. The next book that made my top favorites of the year, I think I read this in February, and this is Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands. I love the series so much. I can't even go into it. Actually, a fun story about this book specifically is I did a pre-order of the UK edition from Waterstones, which is this beautiful UK edition. I think this is like the prettiest book I've ever seen in my life. So I pre-ordered it, I don't know, a couple of months before it came out. I think it was originally coming out at the end of January, but there was actually a shipment of the Waterstones books that were sent out an entire month in advance, so I ended up receiving this book like 3 weeks before it was supposed to come out, and I was so excited about it. I felt like I was cheating almost. I got to read an early copy of it, but I cannot express how much I love this series. I read the first one in 2023 when it originally came out, and then I read this one when it came out, and I actually have also been currently rereading this series. I read the first Emily Wilde book earlier in January, and I loved it so much. Definitely a 5 star. And then I started my reread of this one yesterday, and I'm almost halfway through it, and I'm just having the best time. This series has quickly become one of my all-time favorites. I think it's just one of those stories that feels perfect for me, and like it was meant for me. Like if I could concoct the perfect fantasy book and include all of the specific little elements that I just love, I think it would look something like this series. It's just a very nerdy series revolving around a professor from Cambridge named Emily Wilde who specializes in dryadology. mythology or the study of fairies, and in the first book she ends up going to this cold little island to investigate one of the species of fae that lives there. It's the last piece of information she needs to complete her encyclopedia, and in this story we're kind of following around the continuation of that as she travels to a little alpine town in Austria to investigate something else, and it's just the most fun adventure story ever. It's also very cozy. I think a lot of people consider this cozy fantasy, and I just love it so much. It has fairies, it's historical, it takes place in 1910, natural history, it's following around professors, it has characters that are so funny and have the best banter, and just such a magical story as well. This is my favorite depiction of fairies I've ever read about, and I just love it so much. So this has quickly become, like, I would say in my top 3 favorite series of all time, because it makes me so happy to read. I am so excited for the third one to come out. I think it comes out February 11th, and so I might make a whole little day out of it, go to the bookstore and pick it up. I am just so excited. Definitely my most anticipated release of 2025. The next book I read is Where the Dark Stands Still by A.B. Poranak. This is actually a debut novel, and I remember seeing it a couple times in the bookstore. I think this came out in February and I read it in March, and I was always intrigued. I think this cover is really beautiful. I love the artwork on it, and I just decided to pick it up. It sounded really good and I loved it so much. I feel like this is another one of those stories that feels just perfect for me. It has all the elements that I absolutely love. It's a historical kind of folktale fantasy that is inspired by Polish mythology. It's a bit of a fairy tale as well, and everything about it was just so beautifully done. The writing was lyrical and whimsical. The story takes place in a demon-infested wood with a secret manor and hidden libraries, and it was just so magical. I loved it so much. A lot of people also compare, I think, like the character dynamic to Howl's Moving Castle, which I can definitely see. I love Howl's Moving Castle, and I think the dynamic between these characters did definitely remind me of that. This kind of reminded me a little bit of a combination, I would say, maybe of The Bear and the Nightingale, Howl's Moving Castle, maybe a little bit of ACOTAR as well, just in terms of the plot. But I just had so much fun reading this. It made me so happy, and very sad too. The ending was actually really sad. Ever since, I have just been on the hunt to find more stories like this. I love these types of stories where I can learn about different areas of the world. That was one of my favorite parts of the book, was just learning about all the different Polish mythology, all the different magical creatures, reading about our main characters' beautiful outfits. All of it I just really loved. So if you have any recommendations for more stories like this, I don't even know what you would call this, like subgenre of fantasy. Maybe it's like kind of folktale fantasy, I guess. I love it so much. I had so much fun with it, and it was just so magical and whimsical. Then I finally read Babel by R.F. Kuang. This book is so highly loved and highly regarded. I think it's won so many awards. It won the British Book of the Year award. Like, this is just a very, very beloved book, and I read it and I also loved it. This book just had so much depth to it, so much complexity. It's a historical fantasy that takes place in England, following around a boy named Robin, who is originally from China, but when he was young he was kind of taken away to go study in England and eventually become a translator at Oxford. And so we kind of follow around his life, all the friendships that he makes, and all of the other kind of larger social and political issues going on at the time. And I feel like it's just one of those stories that is so important to read. I loved learning about the history of this period, which is honestly a really tragic history that I think still has a lot of relevancy today. It was just a very sad book, honestly, one of those stories that makes you feel a little bit hopeless about the world, but in a very important way, I think, and in a very powerful way too. I could talk about this book for so long. I think, there are books I love because they make me happy, maybe because they make me sad, but this book just made me think, and I think sometimes maybe that's the most important thing of all. I want to reread this and really dissect it, really analyze it and understand it. I didn't even think that I was enjoying it that much when I read it at the time, but I have just not been able to stop thinking about this book since finishing it. It was just, I've never read anything like it. This is definitely also something to read if you are into linguistics and languages and translation, because there was just so much knowledge about that. That's kind of what the magic system is built around, so it was also very creative in that way. And everything about this book I think was just so well done. I think R.F. Kuang is a genius. I also did read Yellowface last year, and I also thought that was fantastic, so I will continue to read everything she writes. I'm really excited for her new release this year. This definitely had to make the list because it was just so incredible. Then, talking about my favorite books of 2024, we have The Strange the Dreamer duology Duology by Laini Taylor. I feel like this is one of those series that is a lot more fun to read if you don't really know what to expect and what it's about. I would just say that this is like a very, I would say a bit on the nose, whimsical, magical story about fairy tales and stories and libraries and friendship and kindness. It was such a delightful read. It made me so happy. This series has truly changed my life. Like, it was one of those situations when I finished Muse of Nightmares, I was just so blown away. It completely changed my perspective on life and looking for magic and kindness. Just everything about this story really spoke to me. I really felt connected to it, and this is definitely, I would say, up there with my top favorite books of all time. As you can see, I did annotate it a little bit, not anything too detailed. I definitely want to go back, and this one I do have some more tabs to put in, but I rarely ever annotate books, so I feel like that says a lot. But I would just say that if you love stories, if you love dreams, actually I want to say like half of this series takes place in dreams, just everything whimsical and magical and hopeful and lovely, then you have to read this series. I truly loved it. It just meant so much to me. I don't even know what else to say. Like, I can't even talk about the series without just losing my words, because it is just that good and I just loved it that much. So a huge highlight for 2024 was getting to read this series. I know I will be rereading it so many times in my life. It was just so good. Definitely not for everybody though. I will say this is definitely a very overly magical story, which I think maybe isn't for everybody, but if you do love just magic and whimsy, then you have to read it. The last two books that made it to this list I actually read in December, so it was a really great way to end 2024. First, we have The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This book is unlike anything I've ever read, and I honestly don't even know how to talk about it. I feel like I can't really talk about this too much unless I do a reread, because it's one of those stories that is just so layered, and I wouldn't even call it one story. Like, this is a story with so many stories within it, if that makes sense. Actually, it doesn't make sense at all. This is one of those books that you have to be okay with being confused for most of the book. Most of the book I had no idea what was going on, and I was just loving every second of it. I know that this book has been out for a little while now, and a lot of people love it. I have also read The Night Circus, and I did really enjoy that one. I actually want to reread that one this year, but this one was just truly a story, about people who love stories, about people who create stories, about the magic of stories. Just another book that I feel like is a lot more fun to go into if you don't really know anything about it. I would just say that if you love stories and everything to do with magical libraries and books and fairy tales, then you have to read this. I feel like I'm noticing a little bit of a theme here between the types of books that I like. Just like those very overly whimsical and magical ones are my favorite. I would just say that it follows around our main character, Zachary, who is a bit of a book nerd, and one day while he is in the library, he finds this book. He starts to read it, and it turns out that one of the stories from this book is a story about him, something that happened to him in his childhood. Everything just kind of unfolds from there. Secret underground libraries, world of magic, doors and portals and stars, just everything like that. I think another reason why I loved this so much was that within the actual just main story about Zachary and following around his plot, there's also kind of interspersed between all those chapters all these different fairy tales as well that Erin Morgenstern has written, and at first they kind of seem like very random, like you don't fully understand why exactly they were put in there, and then the way that everything just starts to connect. When I was reading this, I quite literally pulled out a notebook and just started jotting down all my notes and connecting things, because I was just trying to figure out how everything kind of layered together, and I was still confused. It still doesn't really make sense, but I'm really excited to reread this and kind of look for all the clues now, kind of knowing how everything connects a little bit better. I also think Erin Morgenstern just writes beautiful fairy tales, so I loved reading those. She has very lyrical prose, and I absolutely loved it. So this book was incredible. I can't wait to reread it, and if any of that sounds good, then you definitely have to check it out. The last book on my favorite books of 2024 list is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. I feel like this is a little bit of an outlier with the other books. It is more high fantasy, kind of heists and missions and spying and all these sorts of things. This series is so popular and so beloved, and I finally got around to reading it, and I loved it so much. I didn't originally rate this book 5 stars. I needed some time to kind of think on it and digest on it a little bit, and then I recently read Crooked Kingdom. I read it in January, and I think after reading Crooked Kingdom, it just solidified that I absolutely loved this series so much. This is just one of the most cleverly written books I've ever read, to be honest. Everything about it was so well done. The characters, the plot. On one hand, it's just a really clever, fun, action-packed book, but on the other hand, you have these characters who you just absolutely fall in love with, who have such a strong connection to each other. But with all that as well, you kind of have this hidden, unexpected depth as well. This is Leigh Bardugo's like fictional fantasy world, but there are so many important themes that she discusses and brings up in this book that I think is really hard to read about sometimes. These characters are just teenagers, but they've been through some really traumatic events. There's a lot of like history pulled into the story, just a lot of really important social themes, I think, and just seeing how these characters have gone through so much but still continue to keep going, I think is such a powerful story to read. I loved all the characters so much. It's also really fun to read about a character like Kaz, who is so clever and intelligent and such a mastermind. It was so good. I feel like I don't need to tell you that. I think most people have read this by now. But if you haven't and you have been waiting, this is your sign, because it was amazing. I loved it. So out of the 92 books that I read in 2024, these top 8 are my absolute favorites. These books mean so much to me, like I cannot express how much I love them. A lot of them have honestly changed me in some way, which sounds so dramatic, but that is what good books do to you. All of these are definitely 5 stars, new favorites. I will probably be rereading all of these as well. So good. I feel like a very accurate representation of my reading taste. I am so excited to continue reading. So far 2025, I've just been having so much fun with my reading, so I'm excited to find some new favorites. That is pretty much it for this video though. Thank you so much for watching. I know it's a little bit late, but I feel like these books deserved to have a video made about them, and I just really wanted to talk about them as well. Stay tuned for a reading vlog, I think coming next week, but I will see you later.